The morning sky over Spring Hill was quiet when George Miller, 67, stared at his trembling bank statement. His left hand shook, not from fear, but from an anger he had not felt in 43 long years. It was Christmas Eve, and the bright numbers on the screen made no sense. 7 transfers, each just under $10,000, had drained nearly $47,000 from his savings. He scrolled through the banking app again, squinting at the details. Every transfer led to an account at Pacific Coast Credit Union, a bank he never used. But someone in his house did. Someone who had been smiling in his face for months. Someone who thought he would never fight back. George walked into the kitchen where his daughter Lisa sliced cheese for their evening plans. She looked up with a soft smile. "Dad, you okay? You look pale." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward the garage, where Ryan, her 38-year-old husband, was bent over a motorcycle he had no business owning. The man wore a tank top that showed off the muscles he was too proud of, greased hands moving over a Harley he'd bought last month. George stood at the doorway and said calmly, "Ryan, we need to talk." Ryan didn't look up. "Kind of busy, George." George stepped closer. "It's about my savings account." That was when Ryan finally looked up, annoyance flashing in his eyes. George held up his phone, showing the missing money. $47,000 disappeared from my account. 7 transfers. All to your bank. Ryan wiped his hand slowly, tossed the rag aside, and folded his arms. "And you're telling me this why?" "Because I bank there." George kept his voice steady. "I'm asking if you know anything about these transfers." Ryan laughed without humor. "You think I stole from you? After everything Lisa and I do for you." George stepped closer, his tone sinking lower. "What have you done for me, Ryan?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "We keep you company in this big empty house. We cook. We do yard work. You live here rent-free," George cut in quietly. "You eat my food, use my electricity, and my name is still the only name on this deed." Ryan's face flushed red, eyes narrowing. "Your problem is you can't stand that Lisa chose me. You've been looking for ways to come between us." George didn't blink. "I'm asking about $47,000 that vanished from my account. This isn't drama. This is theft." Ryan turned back to his bike. "I don't know anything about your money. Now leave my garage." George stayed still, refusing to move. "If you accessed my account, if you made a mistake, we can talk about it. But I want my money back." Ryan spun around suddenly, closing the distance in 2 steps. Up close, George could smell the beer on his breath. "You want the truth?" Ryan whispered. "Yeah, I accessed it. Your daughter has power of attorney, remember? You signed it years ago. We needed money." The confession hit George like a punch. "You used something meant for emergencies to steal from me?" Ryan grabbed George's shirt collar. "I borrowed it. And it should have been Lisa's someday anyway." Then Ryan shoved him hard. George stumbled as Ryan shoved him, his hip slamming into the workbench behind him. Tools rattled loudly, echoing off the garage walls. "Ryan, stop." But Ryan grabbed his wrist, his grip tightening like a trap. "I said I borrowed it, old man," he hissed. "And I'm not giving it back." George tried to pull away, but Ryan twisted his arm sharply. A loud crack filled the air, followed by a scream he didn't recognize as his own. The pain exploded like fire, blinding and sharp, drowning out every thought he had left. Ryan stepped back calmly. "Next time will be worse." Lisa rushed into the garage at the sound, eyes wide with panic. "Dad. What happened?" Before George could speak, Ryan answered smoothly. "He fell. Lost his balance looking at the bike. His arm, yeah, it looks bad." George gritted his teeth through the agony. "I'm going to the hospital." Ryan stepped forward with a smirk. "Good luck driving." Lisa hovered between them, torn, confused, looking to her husband for direction instead of her father. George forced himself to stand, clutching his right arm with his left. He walked past them both, every step stabbing pain through his bones. Driving himself to Sharp Memorial Hospital was torture. Every bump sent a lightning bolt up his arm. Hours later, after X-rays and an exam, Dr. Sarah Lopez looked at him over her glasses. "This is a fractured radius," she said. "A clean break, but definitely twisting trauma. Are you sure you fell?" George met her eyes. "I fell." Sarah sighed heavily. "Mr. Miller, I've treated injuries for 16 years. This was not from a fall." George held her gaze. "I fell." She wrote something in her chart, clearly unconvinced. Hospitals were required to report elder abuse, but he refused to let Ryan control the narrative. Back at home that night, George sat in his parked car, staring at the warm glow coming from inside the house. Through the living room window, he could see Lisa and Ryan watching a movie like nothing had happened. Christmas lights twinkled softly behind them. It looked peaceful. It looked normal. It looked like a lie. George cradled his cast gently and let himself feel something he hadn't let surface in years, a cold, focused anger he had once used as a federal prosecutor. Ryan thought he had one. Ryan thought George was weak. Ryan had no idea who he had challenged. Christmas morning was a performance. Lisa made pancakes the way her mother used to, smiling too brightly as she said, "Dad, sit. Let me get your plate." Ryan set the table like a man pretending to care. He even offered coffee. "Want me to pour it, George?" George didn't look up. "I can manage." The room grew heavy with tension. Lisa glanced between them nervously, sensing the shift but not understanding it. George ate in silence, every bite tasting like anger and betrayal. He excused himself afterward and walked to his small workshop, the only place in the house that still felt like his. Inside his workshop, George opened his laptop with his left hand and studied the bank transfers again. Each amount was just small enough to avoid automatic reporting. Someone knew what they were doing. He whispered to himself, "Ryan, you made one mistake. You thought I wouldn't fight." A half-repaired pocket watch sat in front of him, its gears still frozen. He stared at it and exhaled slowly. "Justice takes patience," he murmured, "and I've always had patience." Then his phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Dad, please come out. It's Christmas." He ignored it. George spent the next 2 days in quiet calculation. He researched elder abuse laws, financial exploitation cases, and power of attorney misuse. Every page he read reminded him of one thing: Ryan had crossed a line. On December 27th, he drove to meet an old colleague, Helen Brooks, a retired notary he trusted. Helen opened her office door and stared at the cast on his arm. "Oh, George. Who did that?" He answered the same way he did at the hospital. "I fell." She folded her arms. "You're lying, but that's fine. Show me what happened." Inside her small office, George laid out the bank statements, transaction history, and power of attorney documents. Helen examined each page with sharp focus. "This is textbook financial abuse," she said. "You need an attorney immediately." George nodded. "I want everything the law allows." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Including the part where it costs him dearly?" George met her stare. "Especially that part." She picked up her phone. "I know someone. A fighter. Her name is Ava Parker, and she handles elder abuse cases like a storm." George breathed out slowly. "Call her." Ava met him the next morning at her office, a bright room filled with case files and determination. She shook his hand firmly. "Helen told me you're ready to take action." George nodded. "My son-in-law stole $47,000 and broke my arm." Ava flipped through the documents. "This case is strong. Stronger than most." She tapped a page. "We'll file for restitution and damages. And once we start, he won't have room to breathe." George inhaled deeply. "Good. He doesn't deserve comfort." Ava smiled coldly. "Then, Mr. Miller, let's take it from him." When George returned home that night, Ryan waited in the living room. "We need to talk," Ryan said. George walked past him. "I'm done talking." Ryan stepped in front of him. "What did you do to the accounts?" "My card got declined." George kept his voice calm. "I secured what's mine." Ryan scoffed. "You're being dramatic." George lifted his phone. "This conversation is being recorded. Don't threaten me again." Ryan's eyes flickered. "Recording me? Really?" George nodded once. From now on, everything you say will help me win. Lisa found him later in his room, tears in her eyes. Dad. Ryan says you're trying to ruin us. George looked at her gently. I'm protecting myself. She hesitated. Did he really take the money? George opened the folder slowly and handed her the printed statement. Lisa stared at the numbers, her face draining of color. He said it was for us, for our future, George answered softly. He lied to you, Lisa. And he hurt me. She sank onto the bed. Dad, I don't know what to believe anymore. George placed a hand on her shoulder. Believe the evidence. The following week, Ava filed the case. Financial exploitation. Elder abuse. Assault. Ryan laughed when he was served the papers, waving them at Lisa like they were a joke. Your dad thinks he can scare me. But George watched him closely from across the room. In Ryan's eyes, for the first time, he saw something that resembled fear. This isn't going away, George said quietly. You're facing everything you brought on yourself. Ryan's smirk faded. You'll regret this. George lifted his phone again. Say that one more time. Ryan turned and stormed off. A court date was set for late February, but the pressure started before then. Ryan lost his job after his employer learned about the investigation. His truck payments fell behind. Collection calls flooded their house. Lisa paced the kitchen each night, whispering, Ryan, what did you do? What aren't you telling me? Ryan snapped back, your father is ruining us. But Lisa's voice grew firmer. No. You did this. George kept his distance, documenting everything quietly. The man who once bragged loudly now avoided eye contact, his confidence leaking away like air from a punctured tire. One night, as George passed the hallway, he heard Lisa crying behind her bedroom door. Why did you hurt him? She sobbed. He's my father, Ryan growled back. Stop defending him. The sound of something hitting the wall made George pause. He tightened his cast, steadied his breath, and walked away slowly. It wasn't his place to save her, not yet. But the truth had started working its way into Lisa's heart, shaking loose the lies Ryan had built around her. George whispered to himself, she'll see everything soon. And he knew she would. A week before the hearing, Ryan approached George on the porch. His face looked thinner, his eyes restless. Look, let's settle, Ryan muttered. I'll pay you back, somehow. George shook his head. This is bigger than money. Ryan swallowed hard. Fine. What do you want? George looked him directly in the eyes. I want accountability. Ryan scoffed bitterly. You're going to destroy us. George replied softly, I'm giving you what you earned. Ryan clenched his fists but stepped back, defeated. For the first time, George saw him not as a threat, but as a man whose consequences had finally arrived. The day of the court hearing arrived with cold morning air and a crowded hallway outside the courtroom. George walked in with Ava and Helen beside him, their folders thick with evidence. Ryan sat on the opposite side, shifting nervously in his borrowed suit. Lisa sat behind him, her hands trembling. When the judge entered, the room settled into a heavy silence. Ava stood first. Your Honor, this is a clear case of elder financial abuse and physical assault. Ryan tried to smirk, but the judge's stern eyes wiped it away instantly. Ava presented the medical records, the X-ray images, and Dr. Lopez's notes stating the fracture was caused by twisting force. She placed the documents neatly on the judge's desk and said, Mr. Miller did not fall. He was attacked. Ryan swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. Then Ava played the recording of Ryan mocking George about confusion. The courtroom felt colder. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Hall, this evidence is troubling. George remained silent, watching Ryan shrink into his chair. Next came the bank transfers. Ava showed every transaction, highlighting the pattern of amounts designed to avoid reporting thresholds. She passed forward the investigation summary showing Ryan's access through Lisa's power of attorney. This was deliberate, she declared. Calculated. Repeated. Ryan stood suddenly. I didn't mean, the judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Hall. Ryan obeyed, his confidence crumbling. Lisa stared at her lap, unable to look at her husband or her father. Truth had taken her by the shoulders and would not let go. When it was George's turn to speak, he stepped forward slowly. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I am not here for revenge. I'm here for accountability. My son-in-law took advantage of my trust. And when I confronted him, he broke my arm." His voice never shook. The judge studied him thoughtfully. "Mr. Miller, thank you for your clarity." Ryan shifted again, anger simmering beneath fear. The courtroom watched every moment like a slow, heavy storm building. After reviewing all evidence, the judge spoke in a firm, controlled tone. "This court finds Ryan Hall responsible for financial exploitation and intentional physical harm." Ryan's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "Therefore, the court orders restitution and punitive damages totaling $120,000. The number hung in the air like a hammer. Lisa covered her mouth, tears slipping out silently. Ryan muttered, "This isn't fair," but the judge continued, "Additionally, a restraining order is issued. You are to stay 100 yards from Mr. Miller at all times." Outside the courtroom, Ryan exploded. "You destroyed my life," he shouted. George simply looked at him. "You destroyed your own life." Ava stepped in front of George. "Mr. Hall, say one more threatening word and you'll be arrested before you reach the parking lot." Ryan stumbled back. "I hope you're happy, old man." George answered softly, "No, Ryan. I'm relieved. For the first time in months, I can breathe." Lisa watched quietly, tears streaming. The truth had painted her world in painful colors. The weeks following the ruling were heavy for everyone. Ryan's employer learned about the judgment, and by the end of the week, he was let go. Collection agencies called daily. The truck he loved so much was repossessed one cold morning. Lisa stood outside as two men loaded it onto a tow truck, her expression hollow. George watched from his porch, feeling no joy, only closure. Actions had consequences, and Ryan was walking through every single one of them. Lisa eventually knocked on George's door one evening, her suitcase beside her. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't live with him anymore." George stepped aside gently. "You're always welcome here." She sat at his kitchen table, her hands shaking. "I believed him over you, even when I saw the truth." George placed a warm hand over hers. "You were trying to protect what you thought was love. That doesn't make you weak." She cried openly. "I'm so sorry, Dad." He nodded. "I know." While Lisa stayed in the guest room, Ryan spiraled. He called her repeatedly, begging, threatening, blaming. But the restraining order kept him away from the house. Lisa ignored his calls at first, then blocked him entirely. "I don't know who I married," she whispered. George answered quietly, "Now you do." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Dad, how do I start over?" George smiled gently. "One step at a time. And this time, you won't be alone." Lisa found an apartment near her new job and slowly began rebuilding her life. Ryan, meanwhile, moved into a small rented room outside town, far from a life he once bragged about. Court-ordered wage deductions began hitting his paycheck, each one a reminder of the consequences he had earned. George repaired watches in his workshop again, his arm healing stronger each day. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. But he knew the story wasn't fully over yet. There was one more lesson Ryan needed to learn, and one more moment of closure waiting before the final chapter. Ryan's anger did not fade, it fermented. One evening, he called George from a new number, his voice sharp with desperation. "You think you won? You think ruining me makes you a hero?" George calmly hit the record button on his phone. "Ryan, you are violating the restraining order." Ryan ignored him. "You're a bitter old man." George's tone never changed. "This call is being forwarded to the police." Silence followed, broken only by Ryan's shaky breathing. "You can't keep doing this," he muttered. George replied softly, "You did this to yourself." Then he ended the call. Two officers arrived at Ryan's rented room later that night. Neighbors watched as he was led out in handcuffs, shouting, "This isn't over." But the door closed behind him, and his words vanished into the hallway. Lisa heard the news from a friend and sat quietly at George's dining table. "He's falling apart," she whispered. George stirred his tea. He built a life on lies. Lies don't stand long. Lisa lowered her eyes. I let him lead me blindly. George touched her hand gently. What matters is that you're not blind anymore. She nodded, tears gathering. After 2 nights in jail, Ryan returned to find Lisa gone, their home empty, and his belongings packed into old boxes. He called her 23 times, left messages filled with apologies, blame, and panic. Lisa didn't answer a single one. I can't go back, she told George later. I won't become small again. George smiled softly. That's strength talking. She took a deep breath. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. George nodded proudly. I'll support you through every step. It was the first time Lisa genuinely believed she could start over. The divorce moved quickly since Ryan didn't have the money to fight it. He signed the papers with shaking hands, knowing he had lost everything: his home, his wife, his future. George continued his quiet routines, polishing watch gears and repairing tiny screws that reminded him of life's delicate balance. Lisa moved into her new apartment near the beach, painting the walls herself, choosing her own furniture for the first time in years. When she sent George a photo of her place, he felt something warm in his chest. She was rebuilding, with clarity this time. By early spring, a wage garnishment order began withdrawing money from Ryan's new minimum wage job. 15% of every paycheck went directly to George. Some payments were small, $40, $60, but they arrived steadily, each one a quiet reminder of consequences ticking forward. Ryan complained to anyone who would listen. He's bleeding me dry, he ranted at work. His co-workers shrugged. Shouldn't have broken the law, one of them replied. Ryan had no answer. His anger had nowhere left to go, settling heavy in his bones like winter frost. Meanwhile, Lisa visited George every Sunday afternoon. They cooked together, shared coffee, and walked slowly through the quiet neighborhood. She talked about her new job, her plans to take evening classes, and her dreams of designing her own studio one day. George listened with pride glowing in his eyes. "Dad," she said one afternoon, "you saved my life when you refused to look away." George shook his head gently. "No. I held the door open. You walked through it." She smiled softly. "Then thank you for holding it steady." As the months passed, Ryan's bitterness hardened into silence. He stopped calling, stopped shouting, and stopped pretending he was the victim. He worked long nights as a security guard, watching over buildings that weren't his, earning money he barely saw after deductions. Each paycheck stub reminded him of the judgment he could never escape. He once told a coworker, "I shouldn't have messed with him. The man fights like a lawyer." The coworker replied, "Probably because he used to be one." Ryan stared at the floor, realizing too late whom he had underestimated. One warm afternoon, Lisa arrived at George's house with an envelope. She sat beside him in the living room and placed it in his hand. "Dad," she said softly, "this is the letter I wrote months ago, the one where I apologized. I wanted you to have the original." George unfolded it slowly, reading her handwriting again. Every line carried pain, growth, and truth. He closed the letter and looked at her. "Lisa," he said gently, "you've already made things right. You found yourself again." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Thanks to you." Later that evening, George returned to his workshop, where a 1941 Hamilton pocket watch waited on the table. He adjusted the gears carefully, listening to the soft clicks as they aligned. The watch began ticking with perfect rhythm, steady and true. George smiled. "Some things," he whispered, "can be repaired." He glanced at the doorway, imagining Lisa standing there, proud and growing stronger every day. "And some things," he added quietly, "just need time to heal." His arm had healed. His heart had healed. His home had healed. On the first warm morning of June, George stepped onto his porch and breathed in deeply. The world felt calm again. Lisa arrived minutes later with 2 cups of coffee, smiling in the sunlight. She sat beside him and said, "Dad, I'm happy." George nodded, the weight of months finally lifting. "You deserve every bit of peace coming your way." They clinked their coffee cups gently. Somewhere across town, Ryan opened another paycheck, another deduction stamped clearly with George's name. Justice was slow, but justice was steady, tick by tick, just like the watches George restored. And with that, his story finally settled into quiet victory.